The morning sun cast gentle shadows across Mrs. Robinson's front yard as she knelt beside her beloved rose garden. At 68, she moved a bit slower these days, but her passion for gardening hadn't dimmed one bit. Her weathered hands, wrapped in her favorite floral gardening gloves, carefully tended to each bloom with the same love and attention she'd given them for the past 3 decades. The sweet scent of roses filled the air as she hummed an old gospel tune, the same one her grandmother used to sing while working in her own garden years ago. The familiar melody brought a warm smile to her face as she remembered those precious childhood moments. Her roses had become somewhat famous in the neighborhood, vibrant reds, supple pinks, and creamy whites that seemed to dance in the morning breeze. "Just a little trim here," she whispered to herself, snipping away at an overgrown branch. Her small wicker basket sat beside her, filled with gardening tools she'd collected over the years. Each one had its own story, like the pruning shears her late husband had given her on their 40th anniversary. She paused for a moment, touching the wooden handle with fondness. The neighborhood was quiet that Sunday morning, just the way she liked it. Most folks were either at church or sleeping in. Mrs. Robinson had already attended the early morning service, as she did every Sunday, and now she was enjoying her peaceful morning routine before her son would arrive for their weekly dinner together. She glanced up at her house, a modest 2-story home with pale yellow siding and white trim. The porch swing, which her husband had built years ago, swayed gently in the breeze. Through the front window, family photos were visible, telling the story of a life well lived. Graduations, weddings, grandchildren's birthdays, and countless holiday gatherings. As she worked, Mrs. Robinson noticed Mr. Chen from across the street walking his dog. She waved, and he smiled back, just like they'd done hundreds of times before. This was her neighborhood, her home, a sanctuary. For 30 years, she'd lived here, watching families come and go, children grow up, and trees mature from saplings into the tall shade givers they were today. The morning was perfect, perhaps too perfect. Mrs. Robinson had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, everything would change. She couldn't have guessed that her routine gardening session would turn into something that would shake her community to its core and spark a conversation that needed to be had. She stood up slowly, her knees creaking a bit as she stretched her back. The arthritis wasn't as bad today, thanks to the warm weather. Looking down at her work with satisfaction, she adjusted her sun hat and reached for her gardening bag, where she kept her water bottle and house keys. The roses looked beautiful, especially the new peace variety she planted in spring. A police car turned onto her street, but she barely noticed it. After all, why would she? This was her home, her garden, her Sunday morning ritual. But as the car slowed near her house, something in the air changed. The peaceful morning was about to be shattered in a way that would test her strength, dignity, and faith in justice. Little did she know, her son's timely arrival would soon turn this unfortunate situation into a powerful reminder that knowledge, composure, and righteousness could triumph over prejudice and abuse of power. But for now, she was just a grandmother in her garden, enjoying what she thought would be another peaceful Sunday morning in the neighborhood she'd called home for 3 decades. The police car's tires crunched on the asphalt as it came to a stop in front of Mrs. Robinson's house. She looked up from her roses, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand. The morning light reflected off the patrol car's windshield, making it hard to see the officer inside. Her first thought was that something must have happened in the neighborhood. Maybe Mrs. Parker down the street had needed medical help again. The officer stepped out of his car, and Mrs. Robinson noticed how his hand rested on his belt as he approached. Officer Wilson, as she would later learn from his nameplate, didn't smile or offer a greeting. Instead, his face wore a stern expression that seemed out of place on such a peaceful morning. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the morning quiet like a knife. Mrs. Robinson straightened up slowly, her knees still stiff from gardening. She smiled, though something in her stomach tightened at his tone. "Oh, I'm just tending to my roses, officer," she replied warmly, gesturing to her garden. "They need regular care, especially in this weather." She reached for her gardening bag, thinking she should show him her ID, just to be safe. "Don't move." Officer Wilson's command was harsh, making Mrs. Robinson freeze mid-motion. Her heart began to race as she realized this wasn't a friendly neighborhood check-in. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this area. This is a private residence. Mrs. Robinson's throat felt dry as she tried to explain. Yes, officer, this is my home. I've lived here for 30 years. My ID is right here in my bag. Step away from the bag, he interrupted, moving closer. Mrs. Robinson could feel her hands starting to shake. Through her front window, she could see the family photos on the wall, pictures of her children's graduations, her grandchildren's birthdays, 3 decades of Christmas mornings in this very house. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Lee, who was watering her plants next door, stopped and watched. Mr. Chen, who had been walking his dog earlier, came back around the corner and slowed his pace. Someone across the street had opened their front door to see what was happening. Officer, please. Mrs. Robinson's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. I can prove this is my home. Just let me show you my ID, or we can look at the family photos through the window. But Officer Wilson wasn't listening. His face had hardened, and his words came out laced with something that made Mrs. Robinson's skin crawl. Sure, and I suppose you're going to tell me you own this house too? In this neighborhood? The implication in his tone was clear, and it stung worse than any Rose Thorn ever could. Mrs. Robinson stood straighter, summoning the dignity she'd carried through decades of similar moments. She thought of her late husband, who had always told their children to stand tall in the face of prejudice, but to be wise about it. More neighbors were gathering now. Someone had taken out their phone and started recording. Mrs. Robinson could hear whispers, could feel the tension building in the morning air. The peace of her Sunday morning had evaporated like dew under the strengthening sun. My son will be here any minute for our weekly dinner, she said, her voice clear and composed. He's an attorney, and he can verify everything I'm telling you. She kept her hands visible, remembering all the talks she'd had with her children and grandchildren about moments like these. Officer Wilson's response was to step even closer, his hands still resting on his belt. An attorney, huh? Well, isn't that convenient? His sarcasm was thick, his disbelief evident. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge, and Mrs. Robinson silently prayed for her son to arrive soon. The morning that had started with the gentle tending of roses was now thick with tension. The same neighbors who had watched Mrs. Robinson garden for decades now watched in disbelief as she stood accused of trespassing in her own front yard. But they weren't just watching, they were witnessing, recording, gathering. The community that Mrs. Robinson had nurtured for 30 years, just like her roses, was about to show its thorns in her defense. Everything happened so fast, yet somehow in slow motion. As Mrs. Robinson reached once more for her gardening bag, hoping to show her ID and end this nightmare, Officer Wilson's reaction was immediate and excessive. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force, twisting it behind her back. The pruning shears she'd been holding, the ones her husband had given her, clattered to the ground among her beloved roses. I told you not to move. His voice was loud now, echoing across the once peaceful front yard. Mrs. Robinson let out a cry of pain, not just from the physical discomfort, but from the sheer shock and humiliation of the moment. Her sun hat fell off, landing among the rose petals that had scattered during the commotion. The neighborhood erupted in response. Mrs. Lee next door shouted, "Stop it, she lives here." Her voice trembled with anger and disbelief. Mr. Chen had dropped his dog's leash. Thankfully, his old golden retriever was too well trained to run, and was fumbling with his phone to record what was happening. "She's a grandmother, for heaven's sake." Someone yelled from across the street. More phones were appearing, more neighbors emerging from their homes. The morning sun that had felt so gentle earlier now seemed harsh and glaring, highlighting every terrible detail of the scene. Mrs. Robinson forced herself to stay calm, even as tears welled in her eyes. She thought of her grandchildren, who might someday see this video. She thought of her late husband, who had always taught their family to face injustice with dignity. She thought of her son, who would be arriving any minute for their weekly dinner. The roast she'd put in the slow cooker that morning now seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. "My arm," she managed to say, her voice strained but clear. "You're hurting my arm." The roses she'd been tending just moments ago brushed against her legs, their thorns catching at her gardening pants. The irony wasn't lost on her, how quickly her peaceful garden had become the stage for such ugliness. A young couple who had recently moved in down the block had rushed over, both of their phones held high, recording everything. "We're sending these videos to every news station in the city," the wife called out, her voice shaking with emotion. Her husband was already on his phone, apparently talking to someone about what was happening. The growing crowd of neighbors created a circle around the scene, their presence both a witness and a protection. Some were calling 911, asking for a supervisor to come to the scene. Others were shouting out details about how long they'd known Mrs. Robinson, about how she taught their children, about how she made soup for sick neighbors, and hosted the annual block party planning meetings. Through it all, Officer Wilson maintained his grip, seemingly unmoved by the community's outrage. His face had taken on a reddish tinge, whether from anger or embarrassment was hard to tell. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty as he realized just how many cameras were recording his actions. Mrs. Robinson closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the cool morning air on her face, trying to steady her breathing. In her 30 years of living here, she'd experienced prejudice before, but never like this. Never so blatant, never so physical, never in her own garden. The pain in her arm was getting worse, but she refused to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break down. The sound of a car turning onto the street made her open her eyes. She knew that engine sound, had heard it every Sunday for years. Her son was arriving for their weekly dinner, and she could only imagine what he would see as he turned the corner. His mother, still in her gardening clothes, being held like a criminal in her own front yard, surrounded by neighbors with phones raised high, her roses scattered at her feet. The moment hung in the air like a suspended drop of water just before it falls. The community held its collective breath, watching as a silver car approached the scene. Mrs. Robinson felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that help was coming, worry about how her son would react, and a deep sadness that this was happening at all. But mostly, she felt a surge of strength, knowing that truth and justice were about to arrive in the form of her son, who had spent his career fighting against exactly this kind of injustice. The silver car pulled up to the curb with precision, its engine cutting off with a decisive click. Mrs. Robinson's son stepped out, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. He was dressed in his Sunday best. He'd clearly come straight from church, but it was his calm, commanding presence rather than his appearance that caught everyone's attention. For a split second, he stood frozen, taking in the scene before him, his mother, still in her gardening clothes, being held by a police officer in her own front yard, neighbors with phones raised, scattered rose petals on the ground, his mother's favorite sun hat lying in the dirt. His face tightened, but years of courtroom experience had taught him to control his emotions. "Mom," he called out, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of controlled anger. "Are you all right?" He began walking toward them, his steps measured and deliberate. He kept his hands visible at his sides, briefcase left behind in the car. Years of experience had taught him the importance of such details. "I'm okay, baby," Mrs. Robinson replied, her voice wavering slightly. "Just trying to show the officer my ID to prove I live here." The pain in her arm was getting worse, but seeing her son gave her renewed strength. Several neighbors called out at once, explaining what had happened, but Mrs. Robinson's son raised his hand slightly, quieting them with the same gesture he used in countless courtrooms. His focus remained on Officer Wilson, who had shifted his weight but maintained his grip on Mrs. Robinson's arm. "Officer," he said, his voice professionally neutral but carrying unmistakable authority, "I'm a civil rights attorney, and you're currently assaulting my mother in her own front yard. I'd strongly advise you to release her immediately." He pulled out his Bar Association card with his free hand, holding it up where Officer Wilson could clearly see it. The young couple down the block had moved closer, their phones still recording. "We've got everything on video," the wife called out. From the moment he grabbed her. Other neighbors murmured in agreement, phones steady, capturing every moment. Mrs. Robinson's son nodded acknowledgement but kept his attention on Officer Wilson. "That's my mother's garden you're standing in," he continued, gesturing to the roses. "Those are her pruning shears on the ground, a gift from my late father. Through that window, you can see our family photos on the wall. I've been coming here every Sunday for dinner for the past 15 years. He took another careful step forward. "Now you have two choices, Officer Wilson." He glanced at the nameplate, making sure to remember it. You can release my mother right now, and we can begin discussing how to address this situation professionally, or you can continue this course of action and face the full legal consequences of assaulting an elderly woman on her own property without cause. The neighbors had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Officer Wilson's face went through a series of emotions: anger, uncertainty, and finally, a flicker of realization about the situation he'd created. "I want your badge number," Mrs. Robinson's son continued, his voice still calm but firm. "I want your supervisor's contact information. I want the incident number for the call that brought you here." He pulled out his phone, ready to take notes. "And I want to know exactly why you felt it necessary to physically restrain a 68-year-old grandmother who was gardening in her own front yard." Around them, the circle of neighbors had grown. Mr. Chen's golden retriever had settled down on the sidewalk, as if he too was waiting to see justice served. Mrs. Lee had brought out her phone book, already calling people she knew at the local news stations. The young couple was quietly narrating everything that was happening, making sure their video captured every detail. The morning sun continued to shine down on the scene, illuminating the scattered rose petals, the overturned gardening basket, and Mrs. Robinson's sun hat still lying in the dirt. But now it also highlighted something else: the power of knowledge, dignity, and community coming together to stand against injustice. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for Mrs. Robinson and her son, but for their entire community. The tension hung in the air like summer heat, waiting for Officer Wilson's next move, while Mrs. Robinson's son stood ready, armed with law books instead of weapons, preparing to fight this battle in the way he knew best, with knowledge, composure, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The sound of another police siren cut through the tense silence. A supervisor's vehicle pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. The supervisor, Lieutenant Brown, stepped out of her car and quickly assessed the scene. Her experienced eyes took in everything: the scattered gardening tools, the numerous recording phones, the attorney in his Sunday best, and most importantly, the elderly woman still being held by Officer Wilson. "Release her immediately," Lieutenant Brown ordered, her voice sharp and professional. Officer Wilson's grip loosened instantly, and Mrs. Robinson stumbled slightly as she was freed. Her son rushed forward to steady her, carefully checking her arm where Officer Wilson had grabbed her. The lieutenant's approach was direct but careful. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" She positioned herself between Officer Wilson and the Robinson family, a supple but clear statement of where things stood. Mrs. Robinson's son spoke up, his arms still supporting his mother. "We'll need an incident report number and medical documentation of any injuries." His voice was steady, professional. "And I'd like to formally request all body camera footage be preserved, along with the original dispatch call that brought Officer Wilson here." Lieutenant Brown nodded, pulling out her notebook. "Of course, sir. I'll need your contact information as well." She turned to the gathered neighbors. "I see several of you have video recordings. We'll need copies of those for our internal investigation." The young couple who had been recording stepped forward. "We've already uploaded our videos to a secure cloud storage," the husband said. "And we've got timestamps from the moment Officer Wilson arrived." Mrs. Lee brought over Mrs. Robinson's sun hat, dusting it off gently. "I've known this family for 20 years, she said to the lieutenant. "Mrs. Robinson teaches our community children to garden. She organizes our neighborhood watch meetings." Mr. Chen had retrieved his golden retriever and moved closer. "She bakes cookies for our annual block party," he added. "Everyone knows her here. Everyone." Lieutenant Brown took in all this information, her pen moving quickly across her notebook. Meanwhile, Mrs. Robinson's son was photographing his mother's arm where Officer Wilson had grabbed her, making sure to document any potential bruising. His law training was evident in how methodically he gathered evidence, but his hands shook slightly as he worked, the only sign of how deeply this incident had affected him. "I want to file a formal complaint," Mrs. Robinson said suddenly, her voice firm despite her ordeal. "Not just for myself, but for every other person who might not have a son who's an attorney, or neighbors willing to stand up and record what happens." Her son squeezed her shoulder gently, pride mixing with concern on his face. Even now, his mother was thinking of others, turning her traumatic experience into a chance to protect her community. Lieutenant Brown's face softened slightly. "We'll take your statement, Mrs. Robinson. And I want to personally apologize for what happened here today." She shot a stern look at Officer Wilson, who stood awkwardly by his patrol car, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The neighbors had started picking up Mrs. Robinson's scattered gardening tools. Someone had rescued the pruning shears, her husband's gift, and carefully placed them back in the basket. The roses, though somewhat trampled, still stood proud in their beds, their sweet scent a stark contrast to the tension that lingered in the air. Mrs. Robinson looked at her garden, then at her son, then at her neighbors who had rallied around her. Her voice was quiet but clear when she spoke. "You know, my husband always said that justice is like gardening. It takes patience, vigilance, and a whole community to help it grow." Her son pulled out his business card and handed it to Lieutenant Brown. "We'll need copies of all documentation, including the dispatch records and Officer Wilson's personnel file." His tone was polite but firm. "And we'll be following up on this incident through every proper channel." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the garden. What had started as a peaceful Sunday had transformed into something else, a moment when a community stood together, when justice wore a suit and carried a law degree, when an elderly gardener's dignity proved stronger than prejudice and power misused. Emergency medical services were arriving now, their lights adding to the scene. But more importantly, truth and accountability had arrived, in the form of phones recording justice in action, a son's legal knowledge protecting his mother, and a community refusing to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. The paramedics worked quietly and professionally, examining Mrs. Robinson's arm as she sat on her porch swing, the same swing where she'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset. Her son stood nearby, taking notes on everything the medical team said, while Lieutenant Brown continued gathering statements from neighbors. "The bruising is starting to show," one paramedic said gently, carefully wrapping Mrs. Robinson's arm. "We should take you to the hospital for x-rays, just to be safe." She looked up at Mrs. Robinson's son, who nodded in agreement. Mrs. Robinson glanced at her roses, some of them trampled during the incident. "My garden," she started, but Mrs. Lee stepped forward from the crowd of neighbors that still lingered. "Don't you worry about the garden," she said firmly. "We'll take care of everything." Already, some neighbors were carefully straightening the bent stems and picking up scattered petals. Mr. Chen's wife had appeared with a watering can, tending to the flowers that had been disturbed during the confrontation. The young couple who had recorded everything were showing their videos to Lieutenant Brown. "We've made copies," the wife explained, "and we've already sent them to 3 different news stations." Her husband nodded, adding, "The community needs to know about this. It can't be swept under the rug." Inside the house, the smell of pot roast still filled the air, their Sunday dinner continuing to cook as if nothing had happened. The normality of it struck Mrs. Robinson suddenly, bringing tears to her eyes. Her son noticed immediately and sat beside her on the swing. "We're going to handle this the right way, Mom," he said softly, taking her hand. "Everything's documented. We have witness statements, videos, medical records. This won't be ignored." Lieutenant Brown approached with her notebook. "Mrs. Robinson, I've spoken with my superior. Officer Wilson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." She paused, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "I want you to know that this isn't what we stand for. What happened here today was wrong." The neighbors had formed a protective circle around the porch. Someone had brought over chairs from their own yard, setting them up for those who wanted to stay. Another neighbor arrived with a tray of ice water for everyone. The community's response was clear. They weren't going anywhere until they were sure Mrs. Robinson was okay. "The news vans are on their way," someone called from the street. True enough, a local reporter had already arrived, notebook in hand, approaching carefully with respect for the situation. Mrs. Robinson straightened her back, years of teaching experience showing in her posture. "If they want to tell this story," she said clearly, "then let's tell it right. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever faced this kind of treatment without having the support I have." Her son pulled out his phone, checking his messages. "The Civil Rights Commission has already been notified. They want to review the case." He looked at Lieutenant Brown. "We'll need all the documentation as soon as possible." The paramedics were preparing to transport Mrs. Robinson to the hospital, but she paused, looking at her neighbors. "Thank you," she said, her voice strong despite everything. "Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for standing up." Mrs. Lee stepped forward with Mrs. Robinson's house keys. "I'll lock up and set your alarm," she said, "and I'll take care of the pot roast too." She smiled softly. "We'll have a proper Sunday dinner when you're back home." The community watched as Mrs. Robinson was helped into the ambulance, her son following in his car. Lieutenant Brown stayed behind, taking more statements, ensuring every detail was properly documented. Officer Wilson's patrol car was gone. He'd been ordered back to the station to face questioning. As the ambulance pulled away, the roses in Mrs. Robinson's garden seemed to stand a little straighter, as if they too were bearing witness to this moment. The Sunday morning that had started with peaceful gardening had transformed into something more, a testament to the power of community, the importance of standing together, and the unshakable strength of dignity in the face of injustice. The young couple's phones kept recording, capturing every detail. They knew, as did everyone present, that what happened in this garden today needed to be remembered, needed to be shared, needed to become part of the ongoing conversation about change and justice in their community. 3 months had passed since that Sunday morning in the garden, and summer was giving way to early fall. Mrs. Robinson sat in her familiar porch swing, watching the evening sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her roses were blooming again, more beautiful than ever, thanks to the loving care of her neighbors who had tended them while she recovered. The investigation had moved swiftly, driven by the clear video evidence and the dozens of witness statements. Officer Wilson had been terminated from the force following a thorough review of his record, which revealed a pattern of similar incidents that had gone unreported. But for Mrs. Robinson and her son, that was just the beginning. "The new training program starts next week," her son said, sitting beside her on the swing. He had just returned from a meeting with the police department's leadership. The incident in Mrs. Robinson's garden had sparked significant changes in the department's approach to community policing. Mrs. Robinson smiled, touching the roses in the vase beside her, fresh-cut blooms from her garden, now restored to its former glory. "And how many officers will be attending?" "The entire force," he replied. "They're making it mandatory. And you know what's really amazing? 3 other cities have asked to implement similar programs." He paused, looking at his mother with pride. "Your story really made a difference, Mom." The young couple from down the street walked by with their baby stroller, waving warmly. Their video footage had become a crucial part of officer training, showing exactly how not to handle community interactions, and more importantly, how a professional police response should look, as demonstrated by Lieutenant Brown's intervention. The community had grown stronger too. What happened in Mrs. Robinson's garden had brought neighbors even closer together. The weekly neighborhood watch meetings, now held in her living room, had evolved into community action planning sessions. People weren't just watching out for trouble anymore. They were actively working to prevent it through education and understanding. Mrs. Lee appeared at the garden gate carrying a covered dish. "Ready for dinner," she called out. Behind her, other neighbors were arriving, each bringing food for their new tradition. A monthly community dinner that had grown out of that first interrupted Sunday meal. Mr. Chen and his golden retriever joined them, the dog immediately settling at Mrs. Robinson's feet as if on guard duty. "The newspaper wants to do a follow-up story," he mentioned, holding up the local paper. "They're calling it How a Garden Grew Justice." Mrs. Robinson looked at her front yard, remembering that terrible morning. The spot where she had been standing was now marked by a new rosebush, a special variety known for its resilience, gifted to her by Lieutenant Brown herself. Around it, neighbors had added their own contributions, a bird bath, some wind chimes, a small bench. "You know," Mrs. Robinson said, as more neighbors gathered on her porch and lawn, "my garden has always been more than just flowers. It's been a place where life lessons grow." She touched her arm, where the bruises had long since faded. "Even the thorns teach us something." Her son nodded, understanding. The case had led to department-wide reforms, new training protocols, and most importantly, a stronger system of accountability. But it had also led to something more personal, a community that refused to let injustice take root in their neighborhood. Inside, the dining room table was being set for the community dinner. Children played safely on the lawn while their parents chatted on the porch. Lieutenant Brown, now a regular at these gatherings, arrived in civilian clothes, bringing a homemade pie and updates about the ongoing changes in the department. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Robinson looked around at her expanded family, neighbors who had become friends, friends who had become champions of change, and a community that had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for progress. My late husband used to say that the best gardens are the ones where everyone has a hand in the growing, she said, as people settled in to eat. I guess the same is true for justice. The sun set on her flourishing garden, where roses bloomed stronger than ever, their beauty enhanced by the story they now told, a story of dignity preserved, of community united, and of justice finally taking root and growing, one careful tending at a time.